There is, in some religious areas, the concept of sin. And in the Christian tradition, Jesus having said, once a flaw, say, was pointed out, don't do it anymore. In other words, correct it. And go and sin no more. In other words, don't do this specific thing that is harmful either to yourself or others in the long run anymore. Hence, too, then, the concept of the Ten Commandments as things we should not do. In other words, things not to act upon, things identified by many as potentially quite injurious at times. Such as don't lie, don't kill, etc., as a general concept with exceptions allowed, of course, that in scriptures elsewhere. In other words, don't be too rigid about not making exceptions to the rule. Now, the New Testament claims that one shouldn't be legalistic. You might say too rigid or too perfectionistic in the negative sense, too all or nothing about these rules, about doing or not doing. Now, some, of course, have tried to address this whole concept by simply throwing out all the rules in written form and just doing what you feel like is the best thing to do. That's sometimes termed an antidote to, quote, legalism. Fletcher pointed out this in his book, Situation Ethics. Basically, love is whatever you feel it to be for yourself or others, or both. This is an attempt perhaps to avoid the concept of being too rigid with one's morals, or what they call legalistic. But does any of this go beyond the concept that harm is only caused by what one does, act-wise? In other words, killing, as per a knife or whatever. Or lying, as per words we say. To deceive. And this too, then, in a form otherwise advocated, love, to do things for people, hence the concept of giving alms or being a good Samaritan, giving to charity, etc. But I have a question or two then. This is all focused so many times, I believe, on doing or saying a truth in terms of not saying a deception, to deceive. But what if there is another component to life? What if the other component is this, of not understanding someone very well and then communicating that to them? For it is said, for instance, that our words can very much hurt other people and yet convey truth. Of a certain sort, that is. And that can be very confusing. How can a supposed truthful statement be very hurtful? Beyond, of course, receiving a truth itself. Hence even the phrase, so-and-so killed the messenger of truth. But was it the whole truth or only partly the truth is my question. In other words, can we tell something when we think it's truthful, yet it has a deception, some would call it a lie, built in also? For instance, can we say that so-and-so did something that is very harmful to others, and that is a truth perhaps, widely recognized perhaps, and yet at the same time tell a mistruth, a massive dishonesty, if you will, a massive inaccuracy, by stating a misconception as to how it happened and how it can be corrected? So, for instance, if someone did something that resulted in someone else's being maimed or dying, and it arguably not in the service of justifiable self-defense, many would say, is this an issue then if one makes a claim that is inaccurate as to how it happened or what can be done to correct it in the future? Take, for instance, Patty Hearst, who participated in a robbery, and it being blamed upon her perhaps in a court of law later that she had choice in the matter and shouldn't have participated, whereupon she said, I believe, it was a matter of self-defense. She would have been killed by those around her had she not done so. So my question is then, to simply state to someone else, you have a flaw, you have a, quote, sin, and you should correct it and go on your merry way. Well, is it dishonest to say this in a sense? Is it inaccurate to say so if, in fact, that person couldn't help how this, quote, flaw or, quote, sin came about, and furthermore can't correct it very easily in the future? For I would posit, I would venture to say that it is one thing to say someone is harming someone else, and yet quite a different matter to say that it was, quote, by choice, and that they can easily stop doing so. There may be resources missing or constraints in place, for instance, that prevent change from happening in these areas that are involving someone else being hurt by our mere presence and what we are acting on. So you could say, in a sense, then, it is a flaw, it is a sin, so to speak, to not understand somebody and simply to say, well, you should not do something or another, but a lack of understanding of how it came about and why it might not be easily, if ever, corrected, to me, then, could be termed a sin. It could be termed a flaw that is not easily corrected, and dishonest to say that it is easily corrected. So you might say, to recap here, that Jesus said, for instance, toward certain individuals of the night, shall we say, prostitutes, what have you, stop doing what you're doing and don't do it anymore. Go and sin no more as per that act, so to speak. But my question would be then, what about the flaws of not understanding how one got to be at that point? Or what about if the person can't correct this flaw no matter what? To stop prostitution, for instance, is one thing. But how do we stop some other things, such as misconceptions about other people? That's a growth process, not something we can stop overnight. Understanding people, walking in their shoes, is a growth process going on to the day we die, involving things like data collecting about people and reforming our words as to how we label or interpret everything, how we categorize things. That's not an all or nothing, stop doing it type thing right now. And so thereupon you could say, I believe a sin is supposedly a flaw that can be stopped right away. And yet there are other flaws that can't be stopped right away at all. We can only improve upon the flaw to make it less and less over a lifespan, such as understanding people particularly, having information on them not readily available that would render us more understanding and thus in turn less angry. Hence I find it rather curious to say some people have road rage and others have what you might call righteous anger rage. Which one would it be then? The road rage is said to exist because there are expectations that are fallacious, incorrect, and not getting met. Whereas the righteous anger approach says that your expectations that were infeasible should stand as is, and your anger is thus justified, which to me does not make much sense. I can't quite wrap my head around thus the concept of justifying non-understanding and the anger it creates down the road as supposedly okay if you label it as righteous ununderstanding.